Hello, my name's Edward Backman, and I'm hoping to start a PhD on the philosophy of religion soon. In the meantime, I'm going to read an essay that I wrote for my Substack. It's called Idealism and Christian Theology, Their Fundamental Solidarity and the Reorientation of the God Debate. Of course, idealism, I mean German idealism, the tradition of German philosophy, which began in the late 18th century and extended through to the early mid 19th century. So let's start. My aim in this series, in this essay series, is to do something almost alchemical. I want to consider two thoughts which are widely misunderstood today, combine them and transmute their product into one thought, which will render the first two comprehensible. The first widely misunderstood thought is that of idealism, the philosophical movement in late 18th century and early 19th century Germany. The second thought is that of the Christian God. The latter thought, that of the Christian God, may be far less niche than the former and can less rightfully be called widely misunderstood. But it is undeniable that when Christian theology is presented to outsiders, misunderstandings on the part of speakers and listeners form major, if not impassable, obstacles to free and productive dialogue. I mean misunderstandings of fundamental concepts: God, faith, salvation, rule, the rule of God, creation, etc. The state of God talk today betrays believers' trouble with self-communicating. Christian theology has trouble speaking about itself in the modern world. I'm going to pause reading. Look, I don't know if I mentioned it already. This is from my Substack, and I'm reading it here just to see what kind of audience I can reach on YouTube. And this is my basic interest. The ability of Christian theology to communicate itself to people who are on the outside, who are maybe interested in religion and Christianity, but are put off by the way Christians talk sometimes, by, I'll get into it, but, by the appearance that it's all just a bunch of dogma, which you have to accept for, against your own, intellectual proclivities or whatever. So the link to the Substack will be in the description. So I'm going to continue now. If the predicament is, as I just described, that intelligent Christian apologists do not consider the tradition of idealism is bizarre. That intelligent Christian apologists do not consider the tradition of idealism, this is bizarre. So I want to show that in light of idealism, many Christian and non-Christian deadlocks and miscommunications are avoidable, and not due to, for example, the fundamental mysteriousness of the subject matter. Idealism took upon itself the very task of making the Christian religion, or religion in general, available to the public of autonomous knowers. It thematized Christian dogma with unparalleled enthusiasm and rigor in a world where religion's competitors, scientific inquiry and absolute self-determination, these were consolidating themselves into new ultimate concerns. When the idealists were writing, the validity of Christian truth claims was on a trajectory heading toward Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, Marx, and Freud. All of these are great thinkers, but that's not the point, right? Thought and Christian belief were decoupling themselves. But idealism steered itself in the opposite direction, as if to prepare a future for the philosophy of religion, which in fact missed its opportunity to wax into our intellectual second nature. I'll read that again. Thought and Christian belief were decoupling themselves, but idealism steered itself in the opposite direction, as if to prepare for a future for the philosophy of religion, which in fact missed its opportunity to wax into our intellectual second nature. Idealism did not accept that faith should become a private feeling unbothered by thought. Since Descartes, it became impossible to accept truth claims as valid, which the thinking I did not experience as subjectively validated. This was a point of no return and continues to be something which theology must either assume as a challenge in order not to become irrelevant. Unfortunately, today, the spirit of complacency and defeat is widespread, and many public-facing Christian voices declare God to be fundamentally unknowable, faith to be uncommunicable without anything to do with a metaphysical understanding of the world. I will pause here and let me summarize. Broadly speaking, idealism entered the scene in order to make Christian truth claims, for example, about the incarnation, about the existence of God, for example, to make them comprehensible, right? Whereas today, because the tradition of idealism goes, unfortunately, ignored, when you try to ask Christians about these doctrines, they will often refer to their fundamental mysteriousness, that this is beyond the scope of human reason, therefore not available to this kind of free questioning. And that, in my view, that's what creates, a split between Christianity and its outside, that they can't talk to one another, right? And people are getting tired of this. People are getting, like, if you look at Alex O'Connor, like, he's engaging more and more with religion lately because that there should be just this incommunicability, that people are finding this intolerable. And so did the idealists. So this is why I think they're so important. I have a footnote here. Maybe I was wondering if I included an anecdote where I participated in a debate about God's existence. And one of the professors in the divinity department where I was studying tried to convince me that it was a bad idea, that Christians were already losing on the battle of on the terrain of free debate, and that to, enter into a new debate, freely and of my own will, was kind of like a soldier wounded on the battlefield on the ground, waving his arms around, asking for more beating, which I didn't see it that way. I think if Christians are confident that their claims are true, they should be ready to and willing to engage in debate. And that's my being influenced by idealism. Anyways, okay, let's continue. Unfortunately, today, the spirit of complacency and defeat is widespread, and many public-facing Christian voices declare God to be fundamentally unknowable, faith to be uncommunicable without anything to do with a metaphysical understanding of the world. Kant, Schelling, Hegel, the theologians of the 20th century following after them, all believed that they had reconceived religion and faith in such a way as to make it valid and relevant for modern self-legislating nowheres. All of them collected the fragments of a ruined theological tradition and attempted to form a new edifice from the ground up. My argument is that it was the German idealist version of religion's refounding which was truly final and decisive. So I propose a fundamental solidarity claim which connects German idealism and Christian theology. What fundamental solidarity means is that in order to connect the two traditions, it is not necessary to impose on either of them implausible, outlandish, unduly creative, or heretical interpretations. This is an ambitious claim, but it can be noted here that the great theologians of the 20th century, facing the same problems identified above, turned to idealism. Perhaps Paul Tillich did it the most enthusiastically. He knew that idealism can help translate theological concepts which, due to their modern abuse, once carried meanings which were nearly lost completely. Where abusive apologists talk about God the Creator as a preordaining cause whose activity competes with human freedom, Tillich draws on idealism to translate God the Creator into the ground of being. The latter expression, the ground of being, not only more accurately renders the idea present in the word creator, but it also invites us to consider ourselves radically free beings in relation to our ground. And importantly, the expression figures more as a question posed to us rather than an answer to a question. So what I'm trying to say here is that in the 20th century, theologians were struggling to communicate Christianity to a world which became alienated to it, and they turned to German idealism. And Paul Tillich, a great 20th century theologian, did this with great success. He looked to the philosophical tradition of idealism and was able to translate Christian theological concepts into a different idiom, maybe one that was more comprehensible to modern people at the time. So the idea of the ground of being, as opposed to, God the creator of the universe, actually invites us to think of ourselves as free. If I'm subject to a creator, it sounds more like I'm, subject to his whims, whatever he ordained for me, preordained for me. Whereas if I'm subject to a ground, this is a different kind of relationship. Okay. But I want to stress, that the way Paul Tillich rendered the ideas, he made theological doctrines into kind of questions which are posed to us and which animate us in our minds as opposed to answers. Too many Christian apologists think that, for example, answers in Genesis, this is a big example. They think that Christianity is appealing because it has all the answers. Not true. Actually, it's a new, interesting field of questions, right? The last point is significant because it shows how Tillich understood one of the most important knots which entangle Christian theology and modern philosophy. The former, Christian theology, prefigures the latter, idealism, in that it directs our attention away from dogmatic and law-obsessed references to God, that is, answers to questions about God, and toward God's character as a question posed to us. In the same way, Kant's aim was to fundamentally reorient philosophy away from dogmatism, affirmations about transcendent realities, and toward the thinking subject. Kant reconceives philosophy as the questioning of reason instead of its unreflective usage. By emphasizing the capacity of theology to raise new questions in a critical way, instead of just being answers to pre-existing questions, Tillich brings a Copernican challenge to bear on theology, thus making it relevant in a new way to outsiders. By Copernican, I mean Kantian, because Kant is known for what he called his Copernican revolution in philosophy. He clarifies, that is Tillich, how theological problematics are not relics or of a mere historical interest, but instead that they are modern problematics, pure and simple. Tillich continues a translation tradition which began in the early 19th century with idealism. He did not want to answer questions which already populated the God debate. He wanted to change the question. This is what idealism achieves. It changes the question. Take this quote from Paul Tillich's dissertation on Schelling. He wrote his dissertation on Schelling. And this is what Paul Tillich says. Quote, idealism is not only a scientific, in the German, wissenschaftlich, doesn't mean scientific in the English sense, it's broader. Idealism is not only a wissenschaftlich movement, it is above all a religious movement. Theologians and philosophers may reject joining theology and philosophy in a unified and systematic worldview. Nevertheless, they cannot avoid considering the idealist movement from the standpoint of the history of religion as an expression of Christian religious life. End quote. Tillich's view is clearly that in the minds of the idealists, from Kant to Schelling, their project dealt with fundamentally theological stakes. Moreover, according to Tillich, Christianity figured into idealism not merely as an important problem which needed to be solved or dispatched, for example, by reducing the theological to the historical, the divinity of God to conceptuality, etc. Rather, their aim was to join or entangle philosophy and theology without compromising the identity and freedom of either. This means the rendering of Christian truth claims legible and relevant to knowers who now also have as ultimate concerns, 1, the systematic and scientific understanding of nature, and 2, the unconditioned freedom and autonomy of the human person. In the first pages of Schelling's Freedom essay, it is clear that the basic aim of his project was to join our ultimate concerns for freedom, systematic knowledge, and religion. If idealism is successful, then these three all become non-competing facets of one reality. So let me do some explaining here. First thing is that when people interpret the relationship between German idealism and Christian theology, they often claim that idealism wants to somehow get rid of religion by some circuitous or by some way, somehow. So they say that in Hegel, for example, he reduces the divinity of God to conceptuality. He makes the persons of the Trinity parts of a syllogism. He ruins the transcendence of God, basically. This was the criticism of theologians in the 20th century, of some theologians in the 20th century, that idealism is dangerous to theology. I'm arguing it's the opposite, right? Idealism wanted Christian theology to be part, of its project without compromising its freedom and autonomy. One way to describe this, I think this is really enlightening. This has been really enlightening for me, is that, when idealism was emerging, this was a time when the problems that we still face today were also emerging. And these problems are what Tillich calls our ultimate concerns, right? For Tillich, God is just another name for ultimate concern, right? What concerns you ultimately, to the exclusion of all other finite concerns. So the problem is that we have competing ultimate concerns. They don't seem to go well together. And this is what the idealists were realizing. And these concerns are, 1, there's absolute freedom and autonomy, that people are entitled to self-determine themselves. They shouldn't be told what they are and what they should do from an outside, unconditioned authority. 2, there's the scientific concern that we should know nature in a scientific way as opposed to a mythological or some other way which lends itself to domination or superstition or whatever. And now look, we already have a problem because we have scientific knowledge and freedom in the same field. And one of the problems today is that people think the more scientific knowledge we have, the more we discover we're unfree, or we're determined by these hidden causes, whether they be our genes, our psychological, proclivity, whatever. Science discovers the way things are determined, predetermined and unfree, like a machine, mechanical. So how do we fit these together? Science and freedom, right? This is an idealist problem, and it is in Schelling's famous Freedom essay, as I just said. But with that problem already on the table, here comes another problem. Here comes the religious concern, right? We're also concerned with religion, with endowing human life with some kind of ultimate significance or something like that, right? How does that fit in with the scientific concern? Not very well, apparently, and some people bite the bullet. Okay, let's just ditch religion because science is going to do all the work for us. Or let's just ditch science because we have to have faith in God. Or, lots of Christian apologists, you'll see, let's just ditch freedom because God is going to tell us what to do and he knows best and we don't. So the dominating strategy today among apologists, scientists, atheists, whatever, is just to ditch one of these in order to make the other two fit together, or to ditch two of them and just to have the one. Science, freedom, religion. Idealism is interesting because it wants all of them as what I call, non-competing facets of one reality, right? This is highly ambitious. This is really difficult, but I think, if you follow idealism, you can see how this begins to work, okay? Okay, let's continue. So following this introductory essay, I will consider 3 central concepts in the history of idealism, which, when read properly, press toward the entangling of idealism and Christian theology. The first concept is law and criticism, or broadly, the relationship between what Kant calls criticism or critical philosophy and the fundamentally law-governed character of human experience. So I've already written that one. It's on the Substack, if you're interested. And you can see this deals with one of the conflicts. There's criticism, which is self-investigation, introspection, maybe self-determination, and then law, the law-governed character of human experience, that everything is expressible in terms of law, all of nature. This is Newton's or Galileo's insight. So here's part of the conflict. So the second concept is the subject, what Descartes called the thinking I. I've not written that one yet, so don't look for that one. And the last concept is the infamous absolute. So these concepts are in idealism. Law, criticism, subject, absolute. I think these are the concepts which bind Christian theology and idealism together. The final aim being to see how all those 3 concerns are can fit together. And the apologetic situation of Christianity can be helped, basically. That's the goal. So, subject, absolute, law, criticism. None of these concepts are directly theological. None of them, moreover, are introduced by the idealists within theological discourses. If these 3 concepts enact the entangling of philosophy and theology, then this entangling takes place before the religious is thematized within idealism. In many discussions on the idealists' relationship with theology, this goes underappreciated, and attention is drawn to the explicitly theological works in idealist philosophy, such as Hegel's Lectures on the Philosophy of Religion. But this is a problem. For if it is true that the incarnation of God demands a radical reorientation of the way we understand God in the world, the challenging of our basic assumptions about the meaning of divinity's transcendence, or the relationship between universality and singularity, image and imaged reality, finite and infinite, etc., then what will qualify a philosophical system as in solidarity with Christian thought will not be its contents, that is, its surface-level affirmations and assurances about the existence of a Christian God. What will entangle a philosophical system with the Christian tradition will be how, on the level of pure form, it treats those challenges and questions posed to us by the incarnation of God. In the incarnation, God transforms himself, thereby saddling us with inescapable questions of form. Is it possible to affirm the existence of the Christian God in a dishonest way? Sorry, that's not a question. This is a fact. It is possible to affirm the existence of the Christian God in a dishonest way without ever intellectually assuming the challenges posed by the incarnation in all their radicality. And this is how it happens that the gospel is turned into another law, and Jesus' deconstruction of religion is turned into another religion. This move from content to form is supported by the Gospels themselves. Jesus challenges his listeners to think the unity of himself with the Father. How can the Word of God be a man from Nazareth? All that said, to support my fundamental solidarity claim, it will be counterproductive to consider theological topics and dogmatic items. Is Hegel's God a counterfeit double? Does he have a non-heretical doctrine of God? These kinds of questions. It is necessary to turn instead to the question of form, which idealists leave us with. And these questions are arguably the same as those mentioned above. How does the finite relate to the infinite? How does universality relate to singularity, the image to what it images, etc.? This is why instead of looking at theological texts, it is better to consider in a formal way such ideas as law, criticism, the subject, and the absolute. The adventure of idealism is one of assuming the challenge posed to thought by the Gospel of John. How can the fundamental relationship between the finite, Jesus' body, and the infinite, imperishable life, be made palatable, comprehensible? Wolfhart Pannenberg, in the same generation as Paul Tillich, 20th century theologian. Wolfhart Pannenberg credits idealism with having achieved an indispensable innovation on this question. Broadly, the idealists discovered that for the finite to be truly infinite, and not an idle or bad representation, it must enter into a relationship with the finite. This is a purely formal proposition, and its demonstration, for example, throughout Hegel's phenomenology, is carried out on formal grounds. That is, without compelling examples, without the psychic involvement of the person, without Hegel's readers ever needing to take his word for it. In theology, pure formalism can be unpopular. Why pure formalism? Let me do some explaining again. Why pure formalism? The idea is that when people try to decide on what the relationship is between Christian theology and German idealism, they get preoccupied with what the idealists say about God directly. Whereas I'm saying that there are unmistakable and essential hints about what this relationship consists of in the non-theological writings of the idealists. That is, when they assume the problems of pure form, the problems I mentioned above: finite and infinite, universal and singular, image and imaged reality, right? These are questions of pure form. They're not directly about God, right? So we're not really talking about God, but the idea is that the Gospels, the incarnation of God, also raise these same questions. And the way idealists just do their philosophy independently of any Christian commitments, actually, that's what entangles them with the Christian tradition, right? So this is an essential bind. It's not, surface level affirmations about, Hegel says, I'm a Lutheran, blah, 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 although I do like, anyways. But, so pure formalism, that's my goal. In theology, pure formalism can be unpopular. Theological knowledge is often assumed to, among other things, revolve primarily around embodied life, the aesthetic, personal encounter, ethical attunement to the other, and so on. The other, this is a huge phrase in theology sometimes. It depends on what tradition you're in, but everyone talks about the other or the holy other. Not in idealism. You'll find none of this in Hegel. In Hegel, there are no others. Anyways. While forms of knowledge, more resembling mathematics and other modes of formalism, are said to damage personal religious relations. So the more formal we be, the less religious we become. That's the thought. That's the idea which I'm arguing against. This is an example of the spirit of Friedrich Heinrich Jacobi having won the day. He was a contemporary of Kant and the primary historical opponent of my fundamental solidarity claim, who thought that to know God, one must actively guard against philosophical excess. That's a parenthetical. That's a side note. Jacobi is really important here because he opposed religious belief and philosophy, whereas I'm trying to bring them together. because my interest is apologetics and making Christianity comprehensible. For example, it is said that Hegel's reducing the absolute religion to pure conceptuality can only be deadly for religion, that Hegel's philosophy means the end of Christianity and not its creative refounding. That said, I will offer some considerations in defense of formalism from a theological perspective and in the spirit of Hegel's philosophy. Now we're going to defend formalism. Let's see. As an example of pure formalism, consider the famous proofs of Kurt Gödel, which demonstrate, he's a mathematician, which demonstrate the ineluctable incompleteness of any axiomatic system. That within any such system, there will be true theorems not deducible from the axioms themselves. I have chosen Gödel's proofs as an example because, as per Ernst Nagel's fear in the passage below, idealist philosophy, especially Hegel's, has been subject to an extremely troubled reception. So Gödel, I chose him because Gödel with idealism had been misinterpreted, I think for similar reasons. Nagel has pointed out that taken correctly, Gödel's proofs do not call for despair or mystery mongering. They do not, here's the quote, mean that there are truths which are forever incapable of becoming known, or that a mystic intuition, radically different in kind and authority from what is generally operative in intellectual advances, must replace cogent proof. It does not mean, as a recent writer claims, that there are ineluctable limits to human reason, right? So you see people misinterpreting Gödel. They sound a lot like Christian apologists, that there are these mysteries that the mind cannot ever touch or make comprehensible to themselves. So the parallels are interesting between mathematics and philosophy here. Are there unknowable truths? It may seem like it, but not true. Okay, the proper takeaway is that formal thinking, reason, and demonstration, this is the takeaway from Gödel, it is that formal thinking, reason, and demonstration are processes capable of reinvention and mutation like a living being. Law is exposed to life. Now, in this proposition, we have a result, the inscribing of creativity within mathematical reason, the form of reason often taken to be the least creative. But the crucial point is this: how can this result be transformed from an assurance, which sounds nice, into a truth which holds once and for all? The answer is pure formalism. To achieve the result, Gödel had to be maximally strict and mathematically rigorous. He had to engage the process which his result would wind up transforming. Without engaging this process, without assuming universally held mathematical laws, there would remain room for believers in axiomatic completeness to hold out hope. This is the kind of investment in the future, the solution yet to come, which is ruled out, made impossible by every revolution, every time basic laws or operating assumptions are rewritten. Gödel's aim was to rule out the validity of hope. It is in this way that his achievements parallel those of the idealists, both force an encounter between thought and its own freedom via their highly systematic MO and their unwavering commitment to pure form. They knew that to achieve something enduring, that is of any scientific value, assurances, opinions, hopes for solutions yet to come, no matter how brilliantly and compellingly they are worded, count for nothing. One need only look at how violently both Schelling and Hegel distanced their own work from that of the famous polemicist Jacobi, a master of brilliantly worded opinions. In philosophy, there must be demonstration. To this end, Kant invents transcendental argument, the goal of which is to demonstrate instead of merely assert revolutionary and unintuitive propositions such as objects must conform to our cognition. By requiring demonstration, philosophy approaches Wissenschaft, or science, as opposed to the interminable opposition of opinions and perspectives. Kant's goal when inventing transcendental argument was to enact a revolution. He wanted to take the reins and extinguish the metaphysician's hope. the hope that metaphysical discourse would eventually deliver us the transcendent. He wanted his claims to be results which hold for everyone, once and for all, just as Godel did. This is why Kant looked up to mathematics, a discipline wherein something can be established once and for all. Hegel also wanted his philosophy to have a universally compelling once and for all character, and polemicized endlessly against those like Jacobi who were apparently content with well-worded assertions and promises. But he adds a further twist. He says that if it were true that rigid formal structure alone is not sufficient for achieving knowledge, for example, of human life in all its fullness, then the only way to do good on this nice-sounding thought is by bringing formalism to its end, that is, by committing to it wholeheartedly. Only at the end, at the breaking point of pure form, will its basic inadequacy be demonstrated once and for all. Otherwise, the initial and undemonstrated refusal of formal structure risks inadvertently becoming a new and binding structure. I'm going to explain this difficult point. Todd McGowan clarifies this point when he refuses the Hegelianism of Walt Whitman to directly say, I contradict myself, I contain multitudes, in fact, fails the criticism or deconstruction of identity, which was intended. The contradictoriness, which was the goal for Whitman, risks becoming a new rigid identity. The same goes for formalism itself. The love of pure form can ossify into a new content which burdens the freedom of thought. And here I cite Rebecca Comey and Frank Ruda because they jointly in their book, The Dash, there'll be a bibliography in the description, they identify this as Hegel's critique of Kant. That is, for Hegel, Kant didn't take his formalism far enough, by relying on just a table of categories, which he got from Aristotle. It's just this kind of residue of like content which gets unexplained. And why is there 12 of them? Why not 16? Why not 8 categories? It's really, this is not pure formalism at its purest. Hegel is very upset with this. The only way to do good on the nice sounding thought that I contain multitudes is to experience the ultimate ineluctable failure of one's identity. That is, to commit oneself to unity entirely, to exhaust this commitment and stumble over the breaking point. Analogously, in a rough way, we can say that Godel had to assume the completeness of all mathematical systems in order to demonstrate their necessary incompleteness. While it is easy and alluring for a non-mathematician to believe that all axiomatic systems are incomplete, it takes solid mathematics to demonstrate that this is true and to know its real implications. This broadly captures how Hegel stands vis-a-vis the enemies of formalism. Without these considerations, it is difficult to understand why Hegel would commit himself unwaveringly to purely formal arguments. As with Kant and Godel, his aim was to transform assertions into demonstrated truths. In conclusion, now we're going to the end. We've defended Hegel's formalism. And the reason we did that is because formalism, too often, it seems like an enemy of theology. That if we're talking about theology, we're not using just formal arguments and demonstrations. We're in a different register, mythical, mystical, religious, whatever. So we've defended, using Gödel's arguments, we've defended Hegel's formalism for theology. In conclusion, I want to point out that there is already an emerging parallel between idealism, understood as the grafting into thought of science and revolution, that's how I understand idealism anyways, and Christianity. First, as for revolution, just to clarify, this is the concluding 2 paragraphs. Idealism grafts, it includes into thought's foundation, philosophy's foundation, science and revolution. Science and revolution, I think these ideas are present in Christian theology already from the beginning. So let's see how. As for revolution, Christianity's self-understanding as the final religion has been a constant problem in its evangelizing. It has thought of itself from the beginning as a revolution or an event. How can Christianity communicate itself to others its conviction that the gospel bears on everyone, let alone communicate its putative finality in a loving way? Can Christians really go to practitioners of another religion and say, my religion is final? My religion is the end of all religion? Can they do that in a genuine and loving way, without putting people off? Because Christians are committed to believing that's true. Does that automatically cancel dialogue between Christianity and other religions? I raise the question here, and I believe the answer is no, but I'm not going to. That's not the purpose of this one, is to address that difficult question. So how can it communicate? How can Christian theology communicate to others its conviction that the incarnation was a revolution? Or more precisely, the revolution in the history of religion. It's a revolution. It's not just a thing that happened. Countless gods got incarnated in the history of religion. Why is Christianity has to believe, they do believe, that their version is different, that it's final, it's revolutionary. It was like a turning point. It changed all of time, So by raising the question of finality, Christianity also uniquely engages the dynamics of hope touched on above. I mean with Godel. Godel's aim was to rule out hope. People hope that axiomatic systems can be complete. His aim was to say, that's invalid. Absolutely, full stop. You cannot hope for that. Because look, I've demonstrated it. Here's the proof. So he wanted to rule out hope. And Christianity kind of does the same thing, which sounds unintuitive, but let's see. Of course, as Barth said, Karl Barth, famous theologian, without eschatological hope, there is no Christianity. But at the same time, the finality of the Christian revelation serves to extinguish all hope. That is, idolatry in the form of hope. The refusal to be challenged by the God-man's wretchedness, to hold out hope that God will reveal himself in another way, hope that the interminable question posed to us by Jesus will be answered by a somehow more final revelation. Christianity and Hegel seem here to carry the same terribly sobering message. We are at the end. There is nothing left in the cup. So much for Christianity and revolution. Secondly, the idea of science factors into the basic constitution of the Christian message. Of course, I do not mean science as the modern practice of forming and testing hypotheses, but the basic revolutionary character of science, that its goal is to demonstrate truths once and for all, is present in the Christian revelation. In other words, those dynamics obtaining between our assertions, beliefs, and intentions on the one hand, and what is true and actual on the other hand, is fundamental in the Christian message. Put concretely, it is one thing to say that God is love, that he loves all his creatures, that sinners will be justified, that he gives himself entirely. But it is another thing to transform these convictions into actualities which obtain once and for all. The incarnation of God is an absolute demonstration that God is faithful to us. We can doubt its reality, but we can henceforth never say that if it is real, then God's faithfulness and love may still be limited in some yet unknown way. And this is a problem for many evangelicals, because they think that something we can do can limit how much God loves us, can limit the relationship he creates between us. Whether that's being gay or whatever, God loves you, but the love is incomplete somehow. Absolutely not. The goal of the incarnation of God, of God's revelation in Jesus, is to rule out all those conditions, all those limiting factors, and say once and for all, no ambiguity, no question about it, God loves sinners, period. That's it. End of story, right? Tony Soprano, end of story. We can henceforth never say that if the incarnation is real, then God's faithfulness and love may still be limited in some yet unknown way. This future invested conditional is ruled out entirely. By reaching a kind of breaking point, God's incarnation rules out all forms of some yet unknown thinking and doubting. In this way, it transforms an assertion and a promise into something actual and real once and for all. The promise of his faithfulness becomes active faithfulness, which is impossible to doubt. Here is one knot, which entangles idealism and Christian theology: the concern to transform what is an intention, promise, conviction, or inner certainty into a reality. What Hegel called wirklich, something actual, a truth. Okay, that's it. That's the essay from my Substack. Why am I doing this? For one, why not? Last time I released a YouTube video, I got like 20 views, which I thought was really cool. I even got a comment. I thought that was awesome. And second reason is that I have finished a master's degree, and like many other in this YouTube scene, I am or was an aspiring academic, but is turning to kind of public-facing mediums, for example, YouTube, as a way of developing ideas, as opposed to the academic world, which, as many may know, if you're still fucking watching this, as you know, can be terrible, like just a bad form, just completely gone down the toilet in the last 50 or whatever it is. Like, people complain about academia all the time. I want to develop a public-facing kind of version of my work, and even my work sounds pretentious. My own personal kind of thoughts, and see if I can have more success there. So my dream is to be one of those, a player in the YouTube, the public-facing kind of scene. If you know, Let's Talk Religion, Alex O'Connor, these are people who are either academics and they're talking about religion in the public sphere. So trying their hand there, see what happens. That's my goal. And if you're still watching, thank you for watching. There is bibliography in the description, all the works I mentioned and so on. And the Substack article will also be linked in the description. So this channel, if it continues, this is just an experiment, but if it continues, the goal is going to be Christian theology and German idealism. And again, my conviction is that, they're separated today by, not intentionally, but because they're both on their own hard to understand. But I think if they're brought together, the apologetic situation of Christianity today, it's struggling to communicate itself. It's, the more it tries to make itself appealing to atheists, the more unappealing it becomes. This is basically how I see it. That situation will be amended slightly by considering this neglected philosophical tradition, which people are put off of because it's so dauntingly incomprehensible. It's not as bad as you think. So read some idealism. Thank you.